This lecture will focus on living as Muslims in predominantly non-Muslim societies. In this lecture, we will explore some of the issues that arise for Muslims living in non-Muslim lands or territories or countries. We will consider some early views of Muslim jurists about Muslims living as minorities, that is, religious minorities, and discuss how these views changed over time. In looking at these early views and legal positions, we will take note of the major schools of law in Islam and how they differed from each other very briefly. Then we will look at contemporary thinking on this issue with a particular focus on the isolationist and participant discourses. Let us look at the issue of Islam as a set of moral values that could be applied anywhere, or whether there is a territorial dimension to Islam. In a previous lecture, we discussed the treatment of minorities living under Muslim rule. In this lecture, we will turn to the issue of Muslims living under non-Muslim rule and consider some of the issues that arise from this situation. A crucial thread that runs through Islamic legal debates on this issue is whether Islam provides simply a set of moral values that could be applied anywhere, or whether there is a territorial dimension to that. In simpler terms, these questions are about whether Islam is just a religion that provides individuals with a moral framework within which to live and which can be practiced anywhere or not, or whether Islam has a territorial aspect to it. Or in other words, do Muslims need to live within an Islamic state or a Muslim majority state to practice Islam fully? Is it possible to be a true Muslim without the guidance of a state, that is, an Islamic state? For the purpose of this discussion, an Islamic state is one which has Islamic law as its system of law. These questions have been important in Islamic legal debates since the 2nd century of Islam or the 8th century of the Common Era. And it was often argued that a proper Islamic life was only possible under the guidance of the Islamic State, where the Sharia or Islamic law is enforced. Let us look at the concepts of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Kufr, and Dar al-Sulh. The debates I just briefly mentioned among Muslim jurists were heavily influenced by a particular way of looking at the world, or a worldview. According to this worldview, the world was divided into two broad domains or abodes: the domain of Islam, or in Arabic, Dar al-Islam, and the domain of unbelief, or in Arabic, Dar al-Kufr. Kufr means unbelief. There are a number of other terms used for the domain of unbelief. Examples are Dar al-Harb, which means the domain of war, or Dar Shirk, the domain in which polytheism dominates. Some schools of law developed a third domain, that is the domain of peace, or in Arabic, Dar Sulh means peace, the domain with which the Muslim state was at peace with. The domain of Islam, or Dar al-Islam, was supposed to be the territory ruled by Muslims, or was in control of Muslims, and where Sharia or Islamic law was applied. It was the place where Muslims could live an Islamically acceptable, ethical, and religious life properly. That's how many jurists saw the issue. With regard to the domain of unbelief, or Dar al-Kufr, where non-Muslims were in political control and where the Sharia was not part of the legal system, many jurists may argue that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to live an Islamically acceptable ethical life there. The argument is Islamic justice and ethics simply cannot be applied unless the state operates in accordance with Islamic principles, norms, and laws. A question for you is, how does this sound to you? Do you think that Muslims are only true Muslims if they live under Islamic rule? Most Muslims today probably would agree that being a true Muslim has nothing to do with where an individual Muslim lives. But this is a view that is very dominant today. It may not have been the case for many, many centuries in Islam. So now let us look at historical evolution of this idea briefly. So we go back to the very early period of Islam. That is not the 1st century, but the 2nd century of Islam, or the 8th century of the Common Era. So from about the 2nd century of Islam, the question of Muslims living under non-Muslim rule began to be of some interest to some Muslim jurists. One reason for this was because communities of Muslims were living voluntarily in non-Muslim territories, most notably in coastal areas of India and China. These Muslims had followed the sea routes and settled on the coastlines of these territories where there were commercial ports. However, at this time, because the number of Muslims living like this was not large, the jurists were not compelled to develop systematic positions on the issue. We must remember that Islam began as both a religious and political movement that evolved through different historical periods and contexts. Many juristic positions taken by Muslim jurists were a response to the different historical and political contexts the Muslims encountered. Let us look at a couple of examples of these juristic debates in this early period. First, we will look at the issue of conversion to Islam and migration. A question for the jurists at this time was that if one converts to Islam while living in a non-Muslim territory, what should the person do? Should the person migrate to a Muslim territory? We'll look at a couple of schools of law in relation to this. Let's look at the Hanafi schools first. One Hanafi position was expressed by an early jurist of this school. His name is Ash-Shaybani, who died in 804 of the Common Era. He argued that there was no duty for this individual to migrate to the domain of Islam or Dar al-Islam after conversion. To support his view, Shaybani used the example of those who converted to Islam during the time of the Prophet and did not move to Medina, where the Prophet and the Muslim community were. Apparently, at this time, Prophet Muhammad accepted their status as Muslims, but living outside of the Muslim polity or in an area where Muslims had not political control. Those Muslims were still considered Muslims. The only difference between them and the Muslims of Medina who were living under the Prophet's rule and Islamic law was that the Muslims living outside the Prophet's rule in Medina were not permitted to share in the spoils of war. The spoils of war was the booty or war booty gained through the Muslims' military campaigns. Let's look at the Shafi'i school now. The Shafi'i school argued in a similar way to Ash-Shaybani. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, or Imam Shafi'i, who is considered the founder of this school, argued that Muslims who converted to Islam in non-Muslim lands may live there. They could stay there unless they feared that they might stray from the principles of Islam or from Islam itself by living in a non-Muslim context. That is, if there is no threat to their religion, they may live there. His primary concern was protection of their religion or their religious identity and the freedom to maintain that. A second example is the issue of traveling to or living permanently in a non-Muslim territory. So let's look at Maliki school of law first. Within the Maliki school of law, one of its key jurists, Sahnun, who died in 855 of the Common Era, reported that Malik, or the jurist to whom the school is attributed, strongly disapproved of Muslims even traveling to non-Muslim lands. He discouraged this even for the purpose of trade. Malik's argument was that it was not appropriate to travel to non-Muslim lands because there Muslims might become subject to non-Islamic law. For Malik, it was unacceptable for Muslims to have to submit to non-Islamic law. Here, the focus is on living under Islamic law. However, a leading Maliki jurist from Muslim Spain, whose name is Ibn Abdul Barr al-Qurtubi, who died in 1071 of the Common Era, argued that Muslims may live temporarily in non-Muslim lands if they are safe there and if they think they can prevail over the non-Muslims. Of course, this was in the context of competition between Muslims and non-Muslims, particularly Christians in Muslim Spain. His concern was more about the lands which were previously under the control of Muslims but later came under the control of non-Muslims, that is Christians, in places like Spain. Ibn Abdul Barr came to this position before the fall of Muslim Spanish city of Toledo in the 11th century of the Common Era. This was a significant defeat for the Muslims in Spain against Christian forces. So, after Toledo's fall, the position of the Maliki school was less tolerant of living in non-Muslim lands. The Maliki school, which was dominant in Muslim Spain, is an interesting case. Its position was very much tied to the historical circumstances that impacted the lived reality of its jurists. As Muslim territory came under siege in places like Spain and Muslim populations were threatened, most Maliki jurists demanded that Muslims make a clear choice in favor of living in lands which were under the control of Muslims. To summarize then, Maliki school generally argued that to live in non-Muslim lands risked living an un-Islamic life and therefore should be avoided. However, other schools of law were generally more open to the idea of Muslims living in or moving through non-Muslim lands. Hanafi school's position is that Muslims may travel to and live in non-Muslim lands, for example, for trade purposes. But the school discouraged Muslims from living permanently in non-Muslim lands. They didn't prohibit that, but they discouraged. For example, the Hanafi jurist as-Sarakhsi, who died in approximately 1090 of the Common Era, insisted that trading with non-Muslims was necessary for public welfare, and therefore traveling to or living temporarily in non-Muslim lands should be acceptable. Still, he did not advise living permanently in non-Muslim lands. The Shafi'i school argued that the ruling on this question could vary according to the context. If a Muslim living in non-Muslim lands was not under any threat to his or her religion or personal safety, then they could stay there. But if they felt they were under threat, they shouldn't continue to live there. An important juristic position was expressed by the Shafi jurist al-Mawardi, who died in 1058 of the Common Era, that is in the 11th century. Let me quote briefly al-Mawardi, and he says, "If a Muslim is able to manifest his religion in one of the unbelievers, that is non-Muslim countries, this country becomes a part of Dar al-Islam. Hence, residing in it is better than migrating because it is hoped that others will convert to Islam through him." End of the quote. This is a particularly important position because it suggests that living in non-Muslim lands might even be preferable to living amongst a Muslim majority in certain situations. It also reframes the concept of Dar al-Islam compared to earlier juristic understandings. The Hanbali school generally argued that living in Muslim lands was the most desirable thing to do. However, a good, ethical Muslim might prefer to live among non-Muslims, and this would not necessarily affect their ability to follow Islam faithfully. Turning to the views of the Shia jurists, particularly the Jafari school of law, which is the Shia school of law, for them, they did not approve, or jurists did not approve of Muslims living in places where they could not be in close contact with Muslim jurists. In their reasoning, this was a dangerous thing to do. For them, it was very important to live among Muslim jurists or close to Muslim jurists who would be able to provide religious guidance. So, as we can see, there were a number of different positions put forward by various Islamic schools of law. There was no general agreement or consensus on whether Muslims should or should not live in predominantly non-Muslim lands or territories or countries. So far, we have been looking at the development of the discourse briefly before the 12th century of the Common Era. Now, let us look at the developments from the 12th century. The context had changed significantly in the 12th and 13th centuries. What we do notice is that after the 12th century, which was the 6th Islamic century, things became a bit more formalized on the legal front on these issues. One of the key reasons was that the political context had changed significantly. By this time, vast numbers of Muslims had come under the rule of non-Muslim empires or polities as a result of non-Muslims conquering large parts of Muslim territories. This was the case with Christians, that is, Crusaders, controlling parts of modern-day Syria, Israel and Palestine, or Mongols conquering much of Central Asia and regions in and around modern-day Iraq. That is the eastern part of the Muslim world then. This means that large numbers of Muslims were under the political control of non-Muslims at this time. These developments forced jurists to rethink their ideas about Muslims living in non-Muslim lands or under non-Muslim or non-Islamic rule. At first, most of the Muslim jurists from various schools of law struggled to develop rulings that took into account all the reasons why a Muslim might be in non-Muslim lands. What might be some of the reasons? Well, I could say there were three main reasons. First, a Muslim might travel to non-Muslim lands for the purpose of something like trade or education. Second, a person already living in non-Muslim lands might convert to Islam. Third, a Muslim land might be conquered by non-Muslims and thus can come under the non-Muslim or non-Islamic control. So with this in mind, let's take a closer look at how the reasoning of each school of law developed, again very briefly. As I mentioned earlier, the Maliki school of law argued that a Muslim should not live in non-Muslim lands because if they did, they would become subject to non-Islamic laws. However, the school also argued that it was legally excusable for Muslims to stay in non-Muslim lands if there were physical or economic obstacles that prevented them leaving. Once the obstacle had been removed, the Muslim must leave immediately. Malikis developed this position in the context of large numbers of Muslim cities and towns coming under Christian rule in Muslim Spain in particular. We have two famous fatwas or legal opinions by the Maliki jurist, by one of the Maliki jurists based in North Africa. His name is Ahmad ibn Yahya al-Wansharisi, who died in 1508 of the Common Era. In the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, vast regions of Muslim Spain came under Christian rule. But in many cases, the Christian rulers had permitted Muslims in those regions they conquered to live as Muslims. Muslims were thus offered what is referred to as mudehar status. This meant that Muslims did not have to convert to Christianity and were able to live as Muslims under Christian rule. Al-Wansharisi argued that Muslims should not accept such a status and in fact condemned those Muslims who accepted this status. He did not believe Muslims would be able to practice their religion freely under such a system. For example, Muslim practices and rituals, he argued, would be mocked or laughed at. Important Muslim practices, such as the call to prayer, might not be practiced, or restrictions could be placed on Muslims with regard to many other important Islamic practices. Again, food would be a good example, halal food and things like that. For these and many other reasons he outlines, he believed any Muslim territory, even if unjust, was superior to territory ruled by non-Muslims, even if those non-Muslim territories were just. Al-Ansari's view reflects by and large the Maliki school's position. The strict position taken by the Maliki school was generally not shared by the other dominant schools of law. On the whole, the other schools of law saw no reason why Muslims would not be able to practice their religion in non-Muslim lands if freedom of religion was guaranteed and the lands were ruled with justice. The Hanbali school and the Jafari school, which is the Shia school of law, argued that Muslims were allowed to live in non-Muslim territory if they were safe and did not fear losing their religion. However, they still preferred Muslims to live in Muslim lands. Importantly, these schools held that the most important issue from their point of view was that Muslims were free to practice their religion regardless of where they resided. The Shafi and Hanafi schools, on the other hand, argued that sometimes residence in non-Muslim territory could even be recommended or even obligatory. Scholars say that these schools took this position partly because they had a more flexible understanding of what Dar al-Islam or the domain of Islam was. These jurists suggested that even a non-Muslim territory could be considered Dar al-Islam if Islamic law was being applied there by Muslims. In other words, if Muslim daily prayer, for example, is still allowed, or if Muslim judges remain there to apply Islamic law for Muslims. Obviously, some jurists had a much more broader understanding of Dar al-Islam, not necessarily tied to application of Islamic law. Shafi jurists argued that Muslim lands that were conquered by non-Muslims could not be classified as the domain of unbelief or Darul Kufr again. This is particularly with reference to the Mongol invasion of much of the Muslim world, particularly eastern part of the Muslim world. For the Shafis, Muslims could continue to stay in those lands if they could contribute to maintenance of Islamic identity and Islamization of those societies. It is interesting to note that these two schools, that is the Hanafi school and the Shafi school, were facing similar historical and political circumstances to that of Malikis in Muslim Spain. During the 12th and 13th centuries, many areas where Shafi and Hanafi schools were dominant came under the control of Christians and also the Mongols. But the jurists ended up taking a very different position to that of Malikis. Instead, the Shafi and Hanafi schools argued that Islam could be practiced in non-Muslim territories, even if non-Muslims were in control, or even if Islamic law was not applied. They even argued that it could be imperative for Muslims to stay and maintain Islam in these lands that were now controlled by non-Muslims. So I hope that this picture of the early and later positions of the jurists and major schools of law has been helpful and has shown how the views of the jurists were shaped by their own historical realities. Now let me turn to some contemporary views on Muslims living as religious minorities in non-Muslim contexts. We will focus on what I call participants and isolationists today. Obviously, the context of today is very different to earlier times. We have modern nation states, equal citizenship is taken for granted, religious freedom is often taken for granted as well in modern states, although the practice may vary from a state to state. At least in liberal democracies, that's the case. There are many views among Muslims on this issue of living in a predominantly non-Muslim society today. However, I would like to highlight here two views that seem to be prominent. These views can be referred to by various labels such as participant and isolationist. In the readings allocated for this session, these were referred to as wasati and Salafi approaches. Wasati approach can be equated with participant, while the Salafi approach can be equated with isolationist. Personally, I'm more comfortable in using the labels participant and isolationist. There are many ways to describe the participants and isolationists. Very briefly, participants are understood to be followers of a more open and flexible approach to Islamic law, norms, and values and practices. On the other hand, isolationists are seen as followers of a more strict and more rigid understanding of these matters. The participant approach not only accepts but encourages Muslims to live in non-Muslim majority countries. They argue that it is important that Muslims are present in all parts of the world, including, for example, in the West, where there are predominantly non-Muslim states. For this reason, participants modify some aspects of traditional Islamic law to accommodate the reality of living as a minority today. This approach approves of Muslims interacting with and integrating into Western societies. In comparison, isolationists take a slightly different position. Put simply, it is much more restrictive. Isolationist approach does not allow for traditional Islamic law to be adjusted, reinterpreted, or applied differently to accommodate the reality of living as a minority. It also explicitly promotes living separately in these societies and keeping a distance from non-Muslims there where possible. So separation, segregation, living separately are important concerns for them. Of course, a key issue today is the issue of voluntarily living in non-Muslim states in large numbers. There are millions of Muslims who are living in non-Muslim states, and often they live voluntarily. This is through migration, for example. Of course, there are many millions of Muslims living in countries like India and China, and these Muslims have been there for generations. So we could say that an important issue that has surfaced in contemporary Muslim thinking about living in non-Muslim lands, which was not a big issue for many earlier jurists, is this issue of voluntarily living in non-Muslim states. In the contemporary context, it is actually taken for granted that many Muslims, in fact millions of Muslims, may decide to live in non-Muslim countries voluntarily. So a key question for Muslim jurists today is, how should Muslims function and interact with non-Muslims in these contexts? As I just mentioned, the participants encourage interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims in these predominantly non-Muslim societies, whereas the isolationists argue for segregation or separation of some kind, or keeping a barrier between Muslims and non-Muslims. In the contemporary period, ideas about equal citizenship, human rights, and religious freedom are widely accepted. Equal citizenship generally means that everyone in a state is considered equal. Not only that, it assumes that people have a certain level of moral obligation to each other as citizens as well, regardless of differences in race, class, ethnicity, or religion. On this basis, many contemporary Muslim scholars argue that it is important for Muslims to develop relations of respect with non-Muslims in a number of different ways. Let us look at some of the ideas of an important Muslim scholar whose name is Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and his idea of fiqh for minorities, or Islamic law for minorities. One of the prominent Muslim scholars today who can be considered participant is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He and a number of others, other scholars, tried to address the issue of living in predominantly non-Muslim societies today through a new sub-discipline of Islamic law called fiqh for minorities, or in Arabic, fiqh al-aqalliyāt, or Islamic law for minorities, meaning Muslim minorities. This is supposed to be a new branch of fiqh or juristic reasoning that specifically aims to address the situation of Muslims living as religious minorities. Qaradawi, like most Muslim scholars today, accepts that the reality that Muslims will choose to voluntarily live in non-Muslim countries. He has therefore worked to identify the specific challenges, or some of the specific challenges that are being faced by Muslims living in these contexts. He argues that it is possible for Muslims to live faithfully as Muslims in states like Western liberal democratic states, and they can also be active citizens in their countries. Given Qaradawi's contribution to this sub-discipline of fiqh for minorities, let me say a few words about his position. Qaradawi and a number of other Muslim scholars of Islamic law have developed this body of fiqh for Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim majority states. One of Qaradawi's works that is relevant to this is his 2001 book called For a Fiqh of Muslim Minorities, The Life of Muslims in Other Societies. It deals with a range of matters related to rituals and practical and ethical issues for Muslims. Qaradawi argues that in general, Muslims living in non-Muslim majority countries are not exempt from practicing the primary obligations of what is in Arabic called ibadat, or acts of worship, such as the 5 daily prayers, or fasting during the month of Ramadan, or paying zakat. So these are obligatory for Muslims wherever they are. He argues that Muslim minorities should follow the rules relating to such matters. Also, rules associated with ethical issues, such as, for example, respect for one's parents, or kindness towards children, or respect for one's spouse, or care for one's neighbors, remain unchanged and should apply to all Muslims, regardless of where they live or work. Importantly, he argues that Muslims in minorities should not engage in things like violence, or unproductive social segregation, or rebellion against the state, and the like. As a general principle, he says, Muslim minorities must obey the laws of the state where they reside. They must also pay taxes. A number of participant Muslim scholars also argue that it is generally all right for Muslims to join even the armed forces of the state in which they live or they are citizens. Scholars like Qaradawi have developed a range of ideas that would help Muslims living in minority contexts. For these scholars, living as Muslims in a minority context is essentially a balancing act between living an Islamic way of life and maintaining positive relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in such a context. Some Muslims living in non-Muslim contexts do choose to leave Islam entirely and fully adopt another religion or the local way of life instead. Others develop an overly critical attitude towards the non-Muslim society they live in. But the participant approach argues that Muslim minorities need to build strong institutions to preserve their Islamic identity and way of life, while adjusting to the local context. This must happen without embracing segregation on the one hand or complete assimilation on the other. For this reason, participants argue that Muslims living as minorities should adopt certain cultural values or practices from the host society. For example, Muslim minorities must learn the local language. They argue that if Muslims don't know the language of their country, they will become marginalized and unnecessary barriers will form between them and the rest of the population. What this position ultimately argues for is that Muslims must be full participants and engaged citizens. Regardless of whether they are living as a minority, it is important for Muslims to be active participants in the society around them. Participants argue that this benefits both Muslims and non-Muslims alike in these societies. So in summary, in this lecture we explored very briefly some of the early Muslim thinking on Muslims living in predominantly non-Muslim societies, as well as the different ways in which Muslim jurists looked at the issue and how, after the 12th century of the Common Era, Muslim thinking had changed because of the changes to the political situation of Muslims. We also looked at some contemporary thinking around this issue very briefly, with a particular focus on participants and isolationists. In doing so, we also looked at the issue of Islamic law for minorities.